On July 24th, 1943, such a night descended upon Hamburg, the kind of night that history remembers in whispers. The city by the river Elbe slept under a humid sky, its people believing the war was far away. But far above the clouds, hundreds of bombers were already on their way, their engines humming like the slow heartbeat of doom. For 4 years, Europe had burned: Warsaw, Rotterdam, London, Cologne. Yet Hamburg had endured. It was Germany's second city, proud and prosperous, a jewel of the north. Its shipyards built submarines for the Atlantic. Its factories forged steel for tanks and weapons. To the people who lived there, war was something that happened elsewhere, in the east, in the steppe, in the snows of Russia. But on this night, war was coming home. The Allies had given the operation a biblical name: Gomorrah, the city destroyed by divine fire. At 10 p.m., the first waves of bombers lifted off from England, black silhouettes against the dying sun. They carried not only explosives, but something far more terrible: a storm of heat and wind that no one on earth had yet seen. In a few hours, Hamburg would become the first city in history to be consumed by a man-made firestorm. And the night sky would burn brighter than the day. In the summer of 1943, Hamburg was a city made of iron and denial. It was Germany's second largest metropolis, home to nearly 2 million souls. The air smelled of coal, oil, and salt water. Smoke curled above the harbor cranes each morning as if the city itself exhaled fatigue. For years, Hamburg had built the engines of war: submarines that stalked the Atlantic, aircraft parts, artillery shells. Its factories were the pulse of the Reich, and that pulse beat with confidence. Even as the Eastern Front bled, even as the British bombers turned Cologne and Essen into rubble, Hamburg remained proud, almost defiant. "We are the gateway to the world," people said. "The war will never touch us." But wars have a way of finding pride. And pride, in 1943, was flammable. The illusion of distance. For most citizens, the war was something distant, a sound heard through the crackle of a radio, a headline read over breakfast. The government kept morale high and the truth buried. Propaganda posters showed smiling workers, not bombed-out ruins. Even the air raid drills had grown routine, almost dull. "We hear the sirens," one resident later said, "but nothing ever happens here." The raids on Berlin were far away. The Eastern Front was another world. Hamburg believed in its own importance, its shipyards, its wealth, its place in the Reich. Surely, they thought, the British wouldn't waste their bombs on them. So life continued, measured, orderly, numb. In cafes, soldiers home on leave tried to forget the snow and blood of Stalingrad. In the factories, women welded and riveted through the long nights. In the streets, children chased each other through alleys still lined with cobblestone, their laughter echoing between blacked-out windows. To them, the darkness of the blackout was a game. To their parents, it was a comfort, a thin veil between their homes and the enemy above the clouds. No one yet understood that darkness can also hide fire. Hamburg, before the fire. The city itself was a masterpiece of order, Wide avenues, red brick districts, elegant canals tracing the old merchants' routes. By day, trams clattered past the town hall. By night, the harbor lights glowed faintly behind blackout curtains. The docks never truly slept. Hammerbrook and Rothenburg sort were crowded with worker tenements, narrow streets where laundry still hung between buildings, where families shared cellars as makeshift shelters. To the north stood the villas and parks of the wealthy. To the south, the lifeblood of industry. And beneath it all lay the thing that would betray them: fuel. Coal, oil, wood, everything a fire could want. In every attic, old furniture. In every basement, barrels of kerosene, crates of tools, piles of rags. A city built to burn, though no one knew it yet. Even the architecture itself, those proud, narrow buildings of brick and timber, had been standing for centuries, strong against storms, weak against heat. The calm before the storm. July 24th was a Saturday. The day began like any other, humid, airless, the kind of heat that makes even the river seem to stop moving. In the morning, dock workers sweated under the cranes. Women queued for bread and potatoes. Somewhere in the city center, a pianist played in a hotel lounge, trying to drown the sound of distant sirens. At noon, clouds gathered, but they brought no rain. Only thunder on the horizon, the kind people mistook for gunfire. By evening, the streets cooled. Families dined in silence. Windows opened to catch a whisper of wind. Mothers tucked children into bed, whispering that the war was far away. Radios crackled with news of German successes in Italy. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang the hour. And then came the sound that would divide Hamburg's history in two: the rising wail of the air raid siren. The signal. At 10:45 p.m., the first warnings lit the night sky. Searchlights swept across the clouds, slicing through the haze. Anti-aircraft batteries on the city's edge roared to life, their shells bursting like pale flowers high above the rooftops. People moved with trained precision. Mothers gathered blankets. Fathers grabbed gas masks. Children carried small bundles of bread. They had done this before, dozens of times, and nothing ever came of it. They believed this would be the same. But this time, the thunder above the elbow was not a storm. It was 791 bombers, Lancasters, Halifaxes, and Sterlings, crossing the coast in formation. Each aircraft carried tons of explosives and incendiaries. Each was guided by a new secret: window, thin aluminum strips that confused German radar and blinded the defenders. The skies over northern Germany filled with ghosts. To the radar operators, it looked as if the heavens themselves were swarming. They couldn't tell what was real and what was illusion. By the time they realized the truth, the bombers were already there. The first impact. The first bombs fell at exactly midnight. They struck the eastern districts: Hammerbrook, Borgfelde, Rothenburg sort. The ground shook. Windows burst outward. High explosive bombs tore open buildings, breaking water mains and ripping apart the roofs that would have smothered flames. Moments later came the incendiaries, thousands of small canisters tumbling through the dark, each igniting upon impact. scattering magnesium fire across the streets. Witnesses said it looked like rain, silver rain, falling from heaven. Within minutes, entire blocks were ablaze. The first screams echoed through the night, mingling with the distant hum of engines. Families rushed to shelters, clutching photographs and documents, believing the fire would pass. But the fire had no intention of passing. It had come to stay. A city awake. In the control rooms of the Luftschutz, the civil defense, chaos reigned. Telephone lines burned out, water pressure dropped, pumps failed. Fire brigades couldn't reach the worst areas. The streets were blocked by rubble and flame. Overhead, the bombers made their second pass. The horizon glowed red. From the docks to the city center, from the Elbe bridges to the Alster Lake, Hamburg was awake, not in fear, but in disbelief. It was as if the world itself had turned against them. And above it all, invisible behind the clouds, the engines kept coming. The people of Hamburg looked up, and for the first time, they realized the sky was no longer theirs. It began as 1,000 small fires, and became something no one had ever seen before. In the first hour after midnight, Hamburg's eastern districts were transformed into an inferno. The high explosive bombs had already done their work. Water pipes severed, hydrants shattered, roofs torn open like wounds. Now the incendiaries poured in, canisters of magnesium, phosphorus, and oil bursting on impact, sending white flame cascading across the streets. The air glowed orange. The city breathed smoke. In Hammerbrook, entire rows of houses were already gone. In Borgfelde, fire brigades fought with hoses that spat only air. There was no water pressure left. The men coughed and screamed, blinded by heat. Their rubber coats caught fire as sparks drifted like ash snow. Above them, the bombers turned for another run. A fire that moved. What happened next would enter the vocabulary of science and horror. As the thousands of individual blazes joined, they began to generate their own weather. The heat was so immense, over 800 degrees Celsius, that it pulled oxygen from the surrounding air. Winds rushed toward the flames, feeding them, strengthening them, until the fire became a living thing. Witnesses would later call it the Feuersturm, the firestorm. The storm created hurricane-force winds, sucking debris, trees, even people into the vortex. Entire buildings collapsed not from bombs, but from the vacuum created as the fire consumed every breath of air. The roar was deafening, like 1,000 furnaces screaming at once. Survivors said it wasn't like being burned. It was like being erased. In the cellars. Beneath the streets, thousands huddled in basements and shelters, believing the earth above would protect them. But as the fire spread, the air below began to thin. The oxygen was being stolen upward. The flames didn't just burn, they breathed. In the shelters, candles flickered and went out. People gasped, clawing at doors that wouldn't open. Mothers pressed wet rags over their children's mouths. Some suffocated without a single burn on their bodies. Others burned alive when the heat finally broke through the cellar doors, turning the air itself into a weapon. One survivor would later write, "The fire screamed. It howled like an animal, and the ground beneath us shook as if the city was alive and dying." The wind of death. Above ground, the storm grew stronger. Trees were uprooted and hurled through the air. Metal shutters twisted and flew like blades. The winds reached over 150 kilometers per hour. Flames leapt from street to street, fed by the gusts. Asphalt softened. Bricks glowed red. The sky itself became an ocean of fire, clouds of smoke rising 10,000 feet high. From miles away, pilots reported seeing the glow, a red wound on the surface of the earth. And still, the fire wanted more. Narrator, low, tense. It wasn't just burning the city. It was consuming the air, the water, the people, everything that made life possible. Voices in the flames. In the chaos, stories survived, fragments of memory scorched into history. A firefighter named Erich Stahl recalled trying to drive a truck through the burning streets. The heat was so strong, the tires melted. The hose nozzles turned soft. We were forced to abandon everything and run. A nurse at the St. Georg Hospital wrote, "The patients begged to be taken outside, but outside was worse. The air burned their lungs." A mother named Kata Pedersen left behind a single line in her diary. "The night was bright as day, and the day never came." These were not soldiers. They were dock workers, nurses, shopkeepers, children. And their city was now a furnace, a storm of ash. As dawn approached, the wind began to die, but the fire didn't. It had eaten everything it could, houses, trees, even the oxygen, and now it began to consume itself. The flames curled inward, collapsing into their own ashes. The roar faded into crackling silence. Where once stood neighborhoods, only black skeletons remained. Chimneys without houses, walls without roofs, streets without names. The smell of burning flesh hung in the air for days. The firestorm had killed more than 30,000 people in a single night. And yet, even in ruin, the city still glowed, a ghostly light rising from the ashes. From above, Allied pilots could see the firestorm's remains stretching for miles. They would later write that it looked like a volcano where a city had been. The morning after. By the time the sun rose on July 25th, Hamburg no longer existed as a city. The once bustling docks were silent. The canals were choked with debris and bodies. Fire brigades that survived staggered through streets of molten glass and twisted iron. Water hoses had fused to the ground. The asphalt was still hot enough to blister skin. In the ruins, some emerged from shelters, faces black with soot, eyes wide, voices gone. They walked like ghosts, searching for homes that were no longer there. Entire families had vanished, leaving only melted jewelry, a watch, a shoe. The scale of destruction defied imagination. In less than 8 hours, Hamburg had become the largest mass grave in modern history. The Allies would call it a success. The survivors would call it something else. Gomorrah. Closing reflection. The firestorm of Hamburg marked a turning point, not in the war, but in humanity. It proved that technology had outpaced empathy. That man could now summon the power of nature itself and turn it into a weapon. For centuries, people had feared fire as an act of God. On that night, they learned that man could play God too. And somewhere, above the smoke, the bombers turned for home. Their mission was over. But the echoes of what they had done were only beginning. The fire died with the dawn. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was the sound of absence, a world stripped bare of voices. For 7 hours, Hamburg had burned as if the heavens themselves demanded payment. When the flames collapsed inward, what remained was neither victory nor defeat, only the shape of loss. The smoke drifted west over the Elbe. The sun rose, pale and distorted, over a city that no longer existed. The people who survived crawled from their shelters in disbelief, blinking against the gray morning light. They stepped into a world they no longer recognized. The shape of the ruins. The first thing they noticed was the heat. Even hours after the flames had died, the ground still burned through the soles of their shoes. Streets had vanished, melted into rivers of tar. Where houses once stood, only chimneys remained, black pillars rising from fields of ash. The canals steamed. Water boiled. The air shimmered like glass. It was as if the city had been drawn in charcoal and then erased by a giant hand. One survivor wrote, "We walked through a dream, and every step broke it further." The living and the lost. From every basement came the sound of coughing, or crying, or nothing at all. People staggered through the smoke, calling names that dissolved in the air. Mothers carried bundles that were not breathing. Firemen collapsed beside their melted hoses. One woman remembered opening her shelter door and seeing her street gone, not damaged, not ruined, but gone, as if it had never been there. "We could see the horizon," she said, "from where our kitchen used to be." In the ruins, time had no meaning. Morning felt like night. Night felt like eternity. A city without air. The firestorm had devoured not just buildings, but oxygen. In cellars, hundreds suffocated without ever seeing flame. Now, in the aftermath, the air itself felt different, heavy, metallic, poisoned by what it had carried. The survivors breathed shallowly, afraid the act might wake the fire again. Even the birds were gone. The wind, too. It was as if nature had abandoned Hamburg, ashamed of what man had done with it. The stillness. The noise of war was gone. No engines, no sirens, no shouts. Just the faint crackle of cooling ruins and silence. You could walk for miles through the city and hear nothing but the crunch of soot under your feet. People whispered without realizing it. They moved like ghosts through corridors of smoke. Some stopped to stare at the remains of familiar things: a doorway, a street sign, the frame of a piano. They recognized the shapes, but not the world around them. "It felt," one man said, like we had outlived civilization itself. The counting of the dead. In the days that followed, soldiers and volunteers began to search. They found cellars filled with bodies, perfectly preserved but gray, as if the fire had turned people to statues. Families were found embracing, mothers shielding children, lovers holding hands. In some places, the heat had been so great that bones fused into the bricks. Entire blocks had become tombs. No one could count the dead with certainty. The numbers blurred like everything else that week. But when they stopped counting, the total stood at over 34,000 and still rising. The aftermath. The city government, under orders from Berlin, issued a statement. Hamburg has suffered greatly, but its spirit remains unbroken. The word sounded hollow against the ruins. Unbroken? The city's spirit had turned to dust. Propaganda posters appeared within days, smiling workers, neat slogans, promises of renewal. But there was no renewal, only exhaustion. People buried their dead in the morning and cleared rubble in the afternoon. They ate bread baked from flour mixed with ash. "We did not live," said one survivor. "We continued." The sky above. For weeks after the firestorm, the sky above Hamburg remained tinted red. Pilots flying overhead said the haze looked like blood smeared across the clouds. Rain would not fall. The heat from the ground sent up waves of distortion that blurred the horizon. At night, the ashes glowed faintly, like dying embers refusing to go dark. People avoided looking at them. They said the light reminded them of faces, of the ones who hadn't come back. The return of sound. It took days for sound to return to the city. The first noises were footsteps, shovels, distant barking. Then came voices, soft, trembling, human. A nurse called out for survivors near the harbor. A church bell, warped and cracked, rang once before breaking. It was not a symphony, but it was something. The silence began to loosen its grip. And in that fragile noise, the people of Hamburg began the slowest act of defiance possible. They started to live again. A city of shadows. When British reconnaissance planes returned days later, they photographed what was left. The images stunned even those who had ordered the bombing. From the air, Hamburg looked like the surface of another planet, gray, cratered, uninhabitable. The pilots described seeing fires still burning deep underground, glowing through cracks in the streets. One officer wrote, "It was as if the earth itself was bleeding." For the first time, some wondered whether the victory had gone too far. The end of the night. On July 25th, the morning after, survivors gathered in what remained of the main square. They stood in silence, men, women, children, all covered in the same gray dust. No one spoke, no one prayed. There were no words left that could fill the space the fire had created. Someone began to cry softly, and that sound spread, not as grief, but as release. The tears fell into the ashes and turned them dark. And for the first time since the night began, the sky above Hamburg was clear. But it was not blue. It was the color of smoke that had finally run out of things to burn. The ashes cooled, but the silence did not. In the months after the firestorm, Hamburg became a city suspended between life and death, a place breathing but not alive. The smell of burned flesh still lingered through the winter air. Even the snow that fell in December came down gray, mixed with soot and bone dust. The fire had taken everything: homes, families, faith. What it left behind was memory, heavy, uninvited, impossible to bury. The ruins that refused to die. When winter arrived, the ruins froze solid. The melted stones cracked under the frost, turning to black ice. Streets were still blocked by debris, and for months, no trams ran. No one could tell where one district ended and another began. The city's landmarks were gone. St. Georg Hospital, the great warehouses, the schools along the canals. All that remained were the chimneys, standing like tombstones in a cemetery of brick. The people called them the ghosts of houses. When the wind blew, the sound that came through the empty windows was like the moan of a choir, a haunting echo that made even the soldiers lower their voices. The work of the living. The survivors worked because work was all that kept them sane. The regime ordered them to clear the rubble, to rebuild, to restore, to pretend. But the rubble fought back. Each shovelful of ash held fragments of the dead: buttons, coins, melted toys, bits of porcelain. "We could not clear it," one woman wrote later. "We were digging through memory itself." Food was scarce, clean water almost non-existent. The canals were poisoned, the wells contaminated with ash. People boiled snow to drink. Children searched for coal in the ruins, their faces black with soot and cold. And still, the government spoke of pride and endurance. "We must show the world," said the propaganda broadcasts, "that Hamburg will rise again." But in the eyes of the people, that phrase, "rise again," had lost its meaning. The burials. When the fires finally cooled, the dead had to be dealt with. There were too many. Entire squares were turned into mass graves. Soldiers and civilians worked side by side, shoveling ashes and piling bodies. No coffins, no names. The air grew thick with smoke again, as the bodies were burned to prevent disease. One officer later described it as a second fire, colder, quieter, but just as merciless. At night, the survivors could still see the glow from the pyres in the distance. It looked like the city was breathing again, but in reverse, exhaling its soul instead of air. The return of normalcy. By the spring of 1944, trams began to run again. Shops reopened in basements that had survived the blasts. Schools were rebuilt using salvaged brick. But the new Hamburg was only a shell of the old one. People no longer looked at the sky. Children flinched at thunder. Every sound of engines sent hearts racing. They lived as if waiting for the next night, when the heavens would open again. Even laughter had changed, shorter, forced, as if joy itself had to apologize for existing. The unspoken guilt. After the war turned against Germany, rumors began to spread. The Allies were advancing. Berlin was bombed. Cities like Dresden would soon share Hamburg's fate. And in the ruins, people whispered. They whispered of punishment, of justice, that perhaps what had happened in Hamburg was not just tragedy, but consequence. For years, those words were forbidden. But guilt has a way of speaking even through silence. Mothers told their children only half-truths. The city burned, they said, but we survived. They didn't speak of why the bombs had come or what Germany had done elsewhere. Memory became selective. And that silence, that refusal to look backward, became part of the fire's legacy. The shadow of rebuilding. When the war finally ended in 1945, Hamburg was already an old ruin. The British occupation began without resistance. The conquerors walked through streets where the enemy was already defeated, not by armies, but by fire. They found a city that still smelled of smoke. One British officer wrote, "It was like entering a graveyard that still remembered the funeral." Yet among the ashes, people were rebuilding. Women, the Trümmerfrauen, carried bricks in baskets, stacking them in endless lines. They cleaned each brick by hand, knocking off soot and mortar until it could be used again. Every house that rose from the ground carried fragments of the one that had burned. Hamburg was not rebuilt over its ruins. It was rebuilt from them. The memorials of silence. As the years passed, memorials appeared, simple plaques at first, then statues, then gardens. But the most powerful memorial was the one no one could see. It was the silence that lingered in every conversation about the war. The people of Hamburg did not speak of the firestorm for decades. The horror was too large, the guilt too complex. When the war generation grew old, their children began to ask questions. What happened? Most answered the same way. You wouldn't understand. That perhaps was true. Because how do you explain a night when the air itself turned against you? The city that remembered. In time, the ruins became museums. The blackened spire of St. Nikolai was left standing, untouched, unrepaired, a wound preserved in stone. Visitors climb its tower now to see the skyline of the new Hamburg. Glass, steel, and water, a city reborn. Yet even from that height, if you look down, you can still trace the old streets, faint scars across the modern grid. The city remembers, even if its people try to forget. Memory, after all, is not something we choose to keep. It is something that keeps us. Hamburg today is alive, bright glass buildings reflecting the Elbe River, music from the harbor, laughter in the streets. Tourists stroll where once the firestorm raged, unaware that the cobblestones beneath their feet were laid from the ruins of 1943. Yet some nights, when the wind turns warm, the air still carries a strange hum, a whisper through the city's bones, as if the stones themselves remember the night the sky caught fire. This final chapter is not about war. It is about what remains after the flames, when the noise fades and history begins to whisper. instead of shout. The mechanics of a firestorm are easy to explain. Heat, wind, pressure, a perfect storm of destruction, born from physics and precision. Thousands of incendiaries ignite at once, roofs tear open, the rising air sucks oxygen from miles around, feeding the flames until the fire creates its own weather. To a scientist, it is a process. To the people beneath it, it was something else. A force that felt alive, intelligent, merciless. Science can explain why the air burned, but not why a mother whispered her child's name as she lost her breath. It can measure heat, but not heartbreak. That night, humanity learned a terrible truth. We could now command nature itself, but not our own conscience. Cities can rebuild walls and bridges, but names are harder to replace. 30,000 dead, 40,000, 50. Numbers are tidy. Memory is not. Each statistic hides a story, a face, a heartbeat. When you walk the streets of modern Hamburg, your footsteps echo over them. Beneath the pavements lie fragments of letters, melted rings, the ash of stories once told. Every summer, rain darkens the ground, and for a moment, the stones glisten, as if the city is remembering itself. At the center stands St. Nikolai Church, left in ruins on purpose. Its black spire pierces the skyline like a scar that refuses to fade. A wound turned into a witness. When the war ended, Hamburg did not speak. Its silence lasted longer than its flames. Some silences are cowardice. Others are reverence. This one was survival. How do you describe a night when the air itself turned against you? How do you tell children that the world once burned their home, not out of hatred, but out of logic? The survivors chose not to. They rebuilt, they moved on. But inside every wall of the new city, the silence remained. An unspoken hymn to the dead. The bombers called it moral bombing, a phrase so clean it could fit in a report. But morality doesn't survive at 800 degrees. It melts, it blurs, it drips down into the cracks of conscience. Those who ordered the operation said it would shorten the war. Perhaps it did. But for the people below, the difference between victory and vengeance was lost in the firestorm. A civilization proves itself not by how it fights, but by what it refuses to destroy. And that night, humanity crossed an invisible horizon. From survival into supremacy, from necessity into choice. When the flames finally surrendered, the city began its slow resurrection. Women, the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, carried bricks in baskets, one by one. Children fetched water from the canals. Men erected frames where walls had collapsed. It was not heroism. It was defiance. Each brick they cleaned bore soot from the firestorm, and each house they built carried the memory of one that had burned. The city was not rebuilt over its ruins. It was rebuilt from them. And when the first tram bell rang again, when the first loaf of bread came from a new oven, Hamburg exhaled, not in triumph, but in endurance. The 20th century would learn to repeat the lesson. Dresden, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Pyongyang, Hanoi, each inferno born from the same belief. That fire could bring peace. It never did. Hamburg's firestorm was not the end of something, but the beginning of a dangerous idea. That total war was possible, and therefore permissible. Fire taught humanity what it could do. But the ashes asked the harder question: what should we have done instead? Today, Hamburg listens. At the harbor, wind hums through the rigging of ships. In the old quarters, church bells ring softly at dusk, and if you stand beneath the spire of St. Nikolai, you can hear it, a faint echo, like breathing beneath the earth. The city doesn't speak in words anymore. It speaks in shadows, in reflections on the river, in the quiet between sounds. Tourists take photos. Locals walk by. But every July, the bells ring once more. Not for mourning, not for victory, but for memory. Some prayers are not said aloud. They exist in the act of remembering, in the small kindness of silence. No one asks for forgiveness. No one claims righteousness. They simply whisper, understand. Understand what fire can do. Understand what forgetting can cause. Understand that breath, the thing fire took first, is now the thing that must be protected most. Imagine this. Night falls over modern Hamburg. The city lights shimmer on the river. A child holds their mother's hand. They stop and look up at the stars. And they do not know what happened beneath their feet. But we know. That is why we tell this story, not to open old wounds, but to make sure the scar is seen. Ashes do not only mourn, they reflect light. If you look closely enough, you'll see that they still glow. History does not end when the smoke clears. It lingers in the air, in the stones, in the choices we make when no one is watching. They called the Operation Gomorrah, a name meant to echo divine punishment. But maybe this story is not about punishment at all. Maybe it's about awareness, the price of forgetting, the courage to remember, because memory is not a burden. It's a warning. And if you ever find yourself in Hamburg on a quiet summer night, stand by the river. Close your eyes, feel the wind. Count your breaths, and remember the night the sky caught fire, so that it never does again.